So what we're going to take a look at next is how we can actually go about testing our controllers. So right now we've got our test suite that's running. If we end up doing npm run test dev, we've got a number of tests that are running where we are testing out our factory as well as our employee object. We'll call it our employee business object. So what we're going to do is we're going to test out a controller that will end up giving us a list of employees. Before we do it, I just want to point out one other thing, that we're getting a little bit lucky here in the sense that so we've taken into account some order here where we're loading Angular first. We've got Angular mocks here. We've got our browser files, which are our source files, and then we've got our test files. And we're getting lucky in the sense that if I went back and I modified this is loading first, which is, again, if we set this up as an application, we would need our module to load first. That's really the only requirement with Angular. But let's, just for the sake of argument, I'm just going to move this. I'm going to put an X in front of this. So now I've changed the name here. And now when I go back and I run my tests, npm run test dev, what I'm going to find out is that everything should end up breaking. And the reason why it's breaking, it's giving me an error that this module app is not available. And that's because it's actually loading them, loads them, I guess, alphabetically, or just the way that you're seeing them here. So really we want this app to load first. So either I could change this back, or just to show you that I could get this to pass, I'm going to say browser.js app.js. You always want to make sure that ends up running first. And now if I ended up going back here, and actually we gave it an X. All right, now if I went back here, and again, whenever you make a change to that file, you have to restart. And now everything is passing. So just to be on the safe side, let's actually put this line in, and let's actually go back here, and we will move this back. And we're going to have to kill our server again and rerun it, and we should be passing again. Let's make that change. I'm actually going to just put this in my repo here. So I've set up a Git repository for this, and we'll say git.commit explicitly loaded app.js. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to test for do a controller test. And let's actually set it up so we have a little bit of a Git workflow here, just for a little benefit. And so I'm going to say git.checkout-b, and this is going to create a branch for me. And I'll say create employees control with tests. So yeah, not a valid name, of course, can't just be a string. So create employees control with tests. Okay, so now I've got a valid branch here. The nice thing about this is that you could go in and do whatever you want to do, and if you don't like it, you can just delete the branch and go back to master here. So once I have this branch set up, what I'm going to do is start doing my tests here. So let's see, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to create another test. And we'll call this employees list employees control spec.js. Misspelling, CTRL. Okay. So there's a couple of tricky things in terms of testing out the controllers themselves. And we'll talk about it. What I'm going to do here, let me do describe blocks. So what am I testing out? The employees control And let's actually start out with just a define, see how that works. And we'll say it exists. And we'll sort of work a little bit backwards here. So the thing is, how do we get a controller? You can't inject a controller. That's not going to end up working. What you really need to do is there's a controller function which exists within Angular, and we're going to use that controller function to create the controller. So if I was to just go over here, I'll say expect employee control, and this is going to be an instance of the controller to be defined. And of course, this is going to fail, and if we do npm run test dev, we should see that failure. Okay, so that doesn't exist. We don't expect it to exist, and in fact, we want to call it employees control. Okay, so let's do a couple things here. We're going to end up bringing in our before each, and this is going to be our module for our app. And then we will go over here, and what we're going to do here is we're going to actually create a variable for $controller. So this will allow us to instantiate a controller. So we'll go over here and we will say before each, and we'll inject. And this is going to be a function, and we're going to get, same as we've done before, this $controller. So this is new. We haven't seen this before. This is something that Angular uses internally, and we're going to use it for our test. So we're going to say controller equals underscore controller. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create this variable employees control is going to be $controller. And all we have to do here is, again, this works with dependency. You don't see it as dependency injection, but what happens is that when the basically Angular goes in and ends up compiling the page, loads the page, it goes and looks for the ng controllers. Or if it has to create a controller from a state change or that sort of thing, or from a directive, it'll go and end up calling this. So here, we're going to say we expect to have an employees control. Again, I like to capitalize the controllers. I've seen it both ways, so I wouldn't necessarily write this in stone. So we go and do this, and let's see, we have an error here, and this is one I often make. Okay, so one issue that I've seen here is that when it ends up creating the controller, it wants to pass the scope into it. And the way that we're going to end up getting the scope is that if we go over here and we say, I'm going to put another variable here, and this is going to be root scope. So the way that scopes get created is they actually get created from this root scope object. And we'll go over here and we'll say root scope equals underscore root scope. And when we go and we create the controller, we're going to pass in. So it's actually looking for this scope object for the controller that doesn't exist. And we'll go over here and we'll say, well, here's your scope. And we can specify that this is going to be root scope. And there is a function on the root scope to basically say, give me a scope. And it'll end up creating a new scope object. Now, the other thing that's worth noting here is that when you're testing out the controller, the thing that you're really testing more than anything else is, changes to the scope or calling methods on the scope and seeing other things getting called. So if we go and do that, we should hopefully see another error. So again, what I have to do is, since I'm creating the controller, I'm naming the controller, and I'm passing in the scope, which, again, a controller is fairly useless without a scope. And here I actually have this error that I expect, which, hey, look, this function doesn't exist. So that's interesting. mentioned before that you have this constructor function for the controller. Okay, unlike factories, which only get called once, this will get called anytime you have a controller that's being used. So let's actually go in and create this. And so let's open up another tab here. And I'm going to say this is going to be my employees control. And so now we'll say Angular module app controller employees control. And once we end up doing that, this test should end up passing. So now our app is going to be aware of this controller. And I think we're getting a different, so actually, this is actually an error that we have in our test. Let's fix that. And I keep on naming this incorrectly. This is employees. Okay. So now this is going to pass, but just to be on the safe side, let's go back here and put an X here, see it go from the right red to the right green. So employees control is not a function, and now it's a function. So this is how you end up getting your controller into the test, is by using this controller function. And again, what you would normally do here is do something a little bit more like this. So we're going to end up creating our root scope, creating our scope, I should say, which your controller needs, and pass it in here. And the reason we do it this way is that we actually want to test out things on the scope. So the next thing we'll end up doing, not only will we see that it exists, but let's actually see that if in fact it uses the fetch all, we're going to end up using our factory, sort of, to fetch our employees, and we want to see that those employees end up showing up on the scope. So we'll end up doing that next. So let's describe, put a nested describe here. And we'll say, let's describe successful fetching of employees. And what is our expectation going to be? Our expectation is going to be scope has list of employees. Well, let's just say employees are set on the scope. All right, if we can't fetch the employees, we can't set them. So let's write out an expectation, and we'll say expect, we'll say scope employees dot length to equal 3. And if we go to run that, we'll see that this is not going to work, right? Because actually scope is not even defined. So let's actually go and start setting this up. I'm going to copy a couple of these things here. And if we go over here, right, we can't read the length of employees. If we wanted to get just a quick pass, just to see that we could actually test things on the scope, we could go over here and inject our scope, right? So our scope that we have for this test, our scope that we just created, will get passed in here, and I could say employees 1, 2, 3. Okay, now our test passed. This is obviously not what we want. So we can actually set this up by, we're going to be, what we really want to do is we want to pass in our factory here. And so what we are looking to do is we know we have this employee factory, and we know that the employee factory has a fetch all method, which is a promise. This is going to give us our employees, right? And they're actually these objects that have these methods on them. And we could say scope.employees equals the employees. Right, so that's a simple use of that factory. And again, we're not getting this to pass. So the problem that we have here is that this is actually trying to make a call, an HTTP request that we can't make anyway. It's not even built. And in fact, if we ended up going and copying something from our factory spec and put this in here, not totally necessary, but at least you'll get an error that says, well, our backend's not defined, so let's just grab our backend and put it here. This is not totally necessary for this, but not the worst idea either. And again, there's ways of drawing this out, and we'll eventually do that so that we don't have to keep on putting these methods in. So HTTP backend equals and now if we go back here we're actually saying unexpected request for employees, right? It's looking at that and saying, I didn't know about this getting called, and this is attempting to get called. At least the backend is this sort of mock backend is getting this request that it doesn't want to get. So how do we solve that? Well, really the easiest way to do that is to go over here, and there's a couple of different ways to do this. One of the things that you could do is that we could actually go in and say, here's our employee factory, and we could go over here and we can pass it in here. So we could do that. Another thing we could also do is that there is a injector. So the injector, instead of actually having all these variables all over the place, we could go over here and we could say injector. Again, we'll use our underscores, and this is just another way of actually injecting. I could inject actually by a name. So here I could go in and say injector equals underscore injector, so I don't have all these, trying to have fewer objects up here. What I really am looking to do is to do something like employee factory injector has a method called get, and I'm going to get the employee factory. So I can do that with a string here. Let's just actually see console.log employee factory. Let me take out a little bit of noise here by just commenting this out for a moment. Right, my test should still fail, but here I actually see that I have my employee factory. Now, I don't want to actually call my employee factory, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to spy on it. And again, these are going to be different with different expectation libraries, or I think for Mocha we end up using Chai, and Chai has its own set of spies, and there's other libraries, something called Sign-On that also maybe handles spies a little bit different than Jasmine. Jasmine is a complete package. I don't have to bring anything else in there. But what I'm really looking to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, I want to spy on. What do I want to spy on? I want to spy on this employee factory. And in particular, what do you want to spy on this employee factory? I want to spy on fetch all. And so this is just how Jasmine works. I want to spy on and call fake. So not only do I want to spy on it, but I also want to stub it out and say, hey, look, when this ends up getting called, we're going to call this fake function instead of calling fetch all. Fetch all calls the backend, and my fake function is not going to attempt to do that. And I'm also going to go over here, and I'm going to inject this employee factory. Although I think we don't even really have to do that, because this employee factory that's up here is in fact going to be the one that gets injected, right? There's only one of these for each factory. The function only gets called once. I don't think I necessarily have to pass that in here. It's just a scope that needs to get passed in. So yeah, so the error that I'm getting here, and you see I'm actually getting this error here on the top. So let's actually go here, and we're going to do the same thing up here. I'm going to actually comment this exists out, because we actually know that it exists because we're using it below. Okay, so now I just want to focus on one thing. So I've actually, my fake is getting called out. How do I know? Well, a couple of reasons, but I am fake. So I could see that this ends up getting logged out. So I get this error. I can't read property then of undefined. And the reason for that is that this fetch all ends up getting called, but there's no, it's expecting a promise, and a promise has a then method. So what we have to do is we have to create a promise here to pass back. Well, how do we do that? Well, one thing we could do is that, and this is not bad to put here, is that I'm going to get, Angular has this promise library that's built into it called the Q library. And so something that you might end up using, and we're going to pass it in here, and we'll say $Q equals underscore Q. So now that we've got our Q library, the Q library gives me the option of creating a promise. So this is the way that the Q library works, a little bit different than Bluebird, is that if I've got Q, I could create this defer, and I can return a promise. So this is the way a promise ends up getting created with the Q library. If I go to run this, again, I'm back to my other message. So it actually went in here, but the problem that I'm running into is that my promise is never resolved, right? I'm passing back this, I'm stubbing out this fetch all method, which is what I want to do. The other thing is that you might say, hey, if you went through this whole hassle of using these, mocking out the back end, and you did that for your factory, why don't you do it here? And the fact of the matter is that I don't need to do it here. I think it's a little bit more work to do here. I'm not really, if I did that, I would sort of be making assumptions when I'm writing my test. And my main concern here is to say, hey, look, I don't really care how the factory ends up getting its employees. I just want it to get its employees. So this is why I'm stubbing my factory out. I'm not testing out my factory. As far as I'm concerned, my factory works. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to resolve, and just for starters, we'll go and resolve 1, 2, 3. Okay? And we run this, and it still doesn't work. Now, this is, when you end up, what I'm going to say here is that when we end up thinking about testing out the back end, like a couple of keywords should pop out, right? We should think about $HTTP backend. We should think about these, two things we're doing here: verifying no outstanding expectation, verify no outstanding requests. When we end up thinking about testing the scope and we're using promises, what happens is that Angular is not the same way that we have to flush our back end when we're testing our factories. we're in a position here where we actually have to go in here, and after we create our controller, we've got to say to our scope, hey, look, scope, run through a digest cycle. And again, the theory is that these promises, there's something that's asynchronous that's going on here, and Angular puts you in a position where the promises don't end up getting resolved until the digest is called on the scope. And this is not something you have to worry about in your code itself, but it's something that you have to do in your test. Because if your code, if you ended up actually making a backend call, the digest cycle is going to run. So now we're in a position here where we actually have to explicitly say, here's my controller, it's sitting here. There's some promises that are getting resolved and we want to make, or rejected, and we want to force the cycle to complete. And now if I do that, this will end up passing. So what I want to, what we could do here, let's actually just make it a little bit more explicit. We could also go over here. Let's say we wanted to do our, Mo, Larry, and Curly, and we say expect, scope, employees 0 dot has region north to equal true, right? We would end up getting this message that we don't have has region is not a function, right? Because we just have a number. So if we wanted to do that, we could go over here. And if we said new employee, Mo, give him north, and we'll do Larry. Let's give him no regions. And we'll give Curly south. South. Now, again, we have a problem here. If we went to run this, and I don't know, we don't have a new Larry object, we've got a new employee. And if we go and run this, we're going to get an error that's a different error. And the error is that employee is not defined. So we could go over here and simply use our injector again, but this time not for employee factory, but for, again, this is our employee business object. And this will end up passing. Just to go from red to green, let's actually go over here and say we expect him, misspell north. Okay, that fails, and we could put this back in. So, any number of things that you could test here. I mean, let's say that we wanted to have some method that we were testing about, maybe that we were going to put something on the scope, like the number of employees without regions, or we were going to filter them out. You could do that as well here. The thing that I want to do is to actually go over here, and this is a pretty quick win. We're going to copy and paste this, and we're going to say, well, what if we're unsuccessful? What if there's an issue? We're going to expect some kind of error message to be displayed, and we'll say error is set on the scope. So if we went over here, we could say we expect scope. We'll just start out by saying error to be defined. And to be defined, okay? I'm misspelling a lot here today. And in fact, undefined is not defined. And what we could do here is, let's talk about how that would end up getting defined, but instead of actually resolving our promise. And we don't need this employee here. We'll say DFD reject. So this is how the Q library works with rejecting promises. Again, it's creating a deferral. The two things you have to do are create the deferral, return the promise, and either resolve or reject. And we'll just say that there's an error. So if we go and do this, again, we still have that same problem, undefined, not equal to defined. But if we go back here, and this is where you want to catch your errors, not in the factories, but in your controllers, because this is really where you probably want to display an error message. And if we come over here, we get our error. And we could say scope.error equals the error that was passed in. So again, fairly simplistic controller, but you could end up getting these various tests to pass. So that's a sort of a quick introduction on controller tests. And again, the sort of tricky part is some of the stuff we've looked at already, where we have the ability to inject things in here. Let's just test again. It's not doing all that much for us. Let's wipe it out. And we have the ability to use our inject function to get different factories and that sort of thing. Controllers are different. We can't inject a controller, but we could do, and we wouldn't necessarily want to inject a controller because we want to have control over that controller, because the thing that we're going to look at is to see that our controller is working, is we're going to look at its scope. The only thing that's really important on the controller is the scope, because the controller is being used to handle our views, and we want to be able to look at that scope object. So even if we could inject it, wouldn't really help us. What we want to do is we want to get this controller, and then with this controller, we can go over here, and we can end up creating this controller, and this gives us the ability to, test things out. And we can, instantiate a controller by using this controller object. We can end up passing the scope in here, and this is going to be pretty helpful to us. Let's see. No, I'm not really going to. Yes, that's interesting. So we don't even really have to set this up as a variable, right? Really, we're testing indirectly through the scope. And again, the sort of key thing here is that when you have anything that's asynchronous, the same way that you call flush on the HTTP backend, you're going to have to call digest on the scope that you're passing in. And so let's clean this up a little bit. I think we have this in two spots, so we set this. And the other thing is that in our case here, we wanted to mock this out. So let's actually just see what our error is over here. Yeah, so I deleted a line I didn't want to delete. What I was sort of getting at before is that we don't necessarily have to look at the controller itself. We could just look at the scope that we're passing in here, and this should still be passing. So that's going to do it for the testing of controllers. The next thing that we'll end up looking at is how we could go about testing directives.